I'm Joanna Masic, and thanks for joining this session. It's organized by the Global Solution Groups for Sustainable Cities and Resilience and DRM. And Zoe Trohannis and I thought it would be a good chance to reflect on some of the experience we've had on urban resilience in the last 3 or 4 years, actually. So this session is going to be looking at building capacity for urban resilience and about applying approaches and tools that we have done in Turkey and Morocco over the last few years, supported by the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery, which is through the Japan World Bank Program for Mainstreaming Disaster Risk Management. So these two activities in Morocco and Turkey were both involving AECOM by coincidence, but they also both involved supporting capacity building of national governments, municipal governments, as well as, in Turkey's case, the Development Bank of Turkey, and looking at how to assess climate and disaster risk in investments and infrastructure build. And they developed various guidance notes, manuals, trainings, and we wanted to have this session sort of provide an overview of what was done in these cases and try to draw some lessons as well for the future and hopefully for some of the teams across the bank. And we've asked Renard Tepelke from AECOM, who's the co-lead for Sustainable and Resilient Cities, Regional Resilient Infrastructure and Green Finance, to present the two cases and the methodologies and some of the outputs and lessons. And then we will have Zoe Trohannis, lead DRM specialist from GFDRR, as a TTL perspective to bring in, to look at what we learned. And also we have invited the team from Morocco. Philip Peterman can't be here. His wife had a baby 2 weeks early. So we've invited Karima Ben-B, who's also heavily involved in the Morocco case. So no loss in terms of understanding the case there from her perspective. And also we've invited Eric Dixon, who is a senior urban and DRM specialist, who will try to draw some lessons and bring some perspective for the work on urban resilience in Africa. So without any more from my side, I will pass to Renard to give us a sort of 20-25 minute presentation on these cases, and then we will hear from the three discussants, and hopefully we can have some time for question and answers. So if you want to put them in the chat or come in after the discussants, that would be great. So over to you, Renard. Look forward to hearing your presentation. Thanks.
Super. Thanks so much, Joanna. Can you see the screen all right?
Yes.
Super. Okay. Apologies again for joining late and getting the time zone wrong. So what we thought today is to recap on these projects. Joanna already mentioned that we had a range of different cities with different risk exposures that we worked with over a couple of years with the World Bank colleagues and with national and subnational partners. For those who are not aware, in Turkey we had cities, some located at the coast, as well as others in more inland areas, but with usually a similar risk profile in terms of obviously high earthquake risk exposure linked to landslides and erosion topics, and then also high flood exposure. And you'll see later on the slides that actually while we implemented the work in Turkey, those hazards did materialize in events in some of these locations. For Morocco, again, coastal city and inland city, Fez and Mohammedia, risk profile slightly different, also due to the geographic location, and also different types of cities, a big role on tourism, heritage, and managing the impact of COVID. COVID, both in terms of local population, but also handling the impacts on tourism and what that meant for the economy in those cities. So very interesting cases there. There was a consistent support to national, subnational government by the World Bank, and then those other TA projects basically plugged in under it to basically strengthen the capacity of these institutions as the additional loan programs were prepared and then implemented. So there are many other projects that are worth mentioning, and I think the colleagues from the World Bank may refer back to them during the discussion. What I thought today is that instead of going through one assignment after another, I actually put the project descriptions in the back of the slide deck, and we can share this after the call, and you can read the standard project descriptions. Instead, for the presentation here, I wanted to pick up 5 topics and reflect on what did we take away actually from our assignments, and what are lessons learned that are also relevant in other geographies, where the World Bank is working with national and subnational governments, both on infrastructure assignments as well as urban and spatial interventions. So you can see the 5 pillars here, and I will spend probably most time on the methodologies, the training, and the products pillars. So getting started with the first piece, I mentioned that we work both at national and subnational level, and that was very critical in recognizing where actually the autonomy sits for certain planning and investment decisions. There was an increasing recognition that of the role that national development banks can play. That's in terms of on-lending, for example, World Bank loans, European Union loans in the case of Turkey, and money from other development banks, but also their role in due diligence and early identification of potential projects and aligning them with requirements from donors, and also updating their own systems. So any other money they are channeling, let it be from the national government, to be aligned and to allow, for instance, for climate resilient or low carbon investments. And so this was quite important to throughout working at the national and subnational level in these contexts, and understanding that this was also a context that was evolving. In both countries, national policy changed when it came to disaster risks, what planning is expected from city governments, and how funding will be made available for different local investments. And so we worked in this context as it was evolving, and was very important to keep track on how governments were implementing changes throughout the process. Moving on to the second topic, it's this element about working both on physical assets, infrastructure, facilities, as well as networks, but also on communities, looking at neighborhood renewal program. In Turkey, for instance, they are called urban transformation interventions, urban transformation plans. Sometimes, for a different perspective, would be that these are slum removal initiatives sometimes, or informal settlement improvements, and to widen the perspective there. Traditionally, we would have planning departments who were mandated to improve informal settlements or settlements that were built a long time ago, which may be exposed to earthquake risks because of low building standards, and to widen the perspective towards climate topics, to understand what is the risk exposure in these areas to the people who are living there, but also what is the potential of making an investment and making that, for instance, into renewable energy, for example, if it's about building retrofitting, and basically tick boxes or achieve several benefits through the same intervention. There were some challenges in the risk assessments. It's fairly difficult to do these assessments for linear infrastructure, for network infrastructure, and that depends very much on the existing data sets and how well the infrastructure facilities and assets have been mapped in the city. Through our assignments, obviously, we are able to use some open data sets, and I'll come back to this in a second. We're also able to work with non-GIS data, but there's a limit to how much time do we have and how much data can we transfer actually into the GIS analysis we would be running as part of an infrastructure risk assessment. And again, it's an ongoing process. It's a conversation with, for instance, local water utilities, energy providers, roads departments, and to discuss what mapping work they actually have ongoing while we are doing the risk assessments. And a key element here was in Morocco and Turkey is to hand over the GIS data at the end of the assignment in local languages also so they can incorporate into their GIS systems. And this ensures an early conversation about what standards and type of data are they using and how can we ensure that those different data sets speak to each other. And that element brings me to the data and the methodology aspect here, the pillar about how did we actually run the risk assessments? What are opportunities and limitations in this regard? I would like to start with an item which is at the bottom of the screen, quantitative versus qualitative analysis. As much as we can use different GIS analysis approaches, we need to recognize limitations on the data side. That could be the availability of data, or it could be the quality and the reliability of data, but also aspects that are non-spatial or that are not yet mapped. This means understanding the municipality's ability to increase resilience could be a matter of how well it conducts its planning in the city. It could be a matter of how it manages its finances and thus has resources available to react when disasters strike, or has resources available to invest more into climate infrastructure. And it could also be an aspect around capacities, management of disaster risks, procedures in place, systems in place to warn populations. So there's a whole range of other elements that are at risk to be forgotten if the only focus is on a GIS mapping exercise that shows you where the hazards are or how vulnerable different infrastructure or communities may be. Linked to this, we had very useful discussions with the World Bank colleagues throughout the assignment as the methodology is advanced on how to present findings actually. There is an issue around map literacy. Are the end users actually able to read multi-layered maps? What are ways to simplify messages and to still have visual outputs that are sufficiently easy to read? And then building up on this, once we pilot a methodology, how can we institutionalize the approach? And this was very interesting in the case, for instance, of the 4 cities in Turkey or the 2 cities in Morocco, where an approach was tried out, it was tailored, it was discussed with the national government and how far it corresponds with the policy that was changing during that time. And then to basically figure out manuals or guidance notes that describe how the methodology was applied so that in the future, municipal governments or the national level or other consultants can replicate the approach and can run it in a similar way. The advantage of this is that you can compare results over time. You can compare results between cities, and that is quite important for national actors who basically, through the rollout of disaster risk reduction programs, want to receive those plans, those assessments from a large amount of cities and then have to prioritize where investment needs to go. So this kind of streamlining of methodologies and handing it over and aligning it with national government requirements was quite important. If I'll move to the to this slide here, I wanted to just illustrate the aspect around presenting findings in a varied way. Top right picture, you can see one city in Turkey, Rize, that we worked on that was struck by two massive landslides of strong flooding followed by landslide while we were working there. This was very important to discuss with stakeholders what were the reasons for those events, how are they linked to the mapping analysis we were actually doing. Bottom left, you can see an example from Tekirdağ, where we used Google Street View images actually to exemplify in our reports what it means in terms of sea level rise, risk of tsunami, or other storm surges. Because the maps may show things in green, yellow, and red, but actually adding imagery that exactly shows how development has taken place in different parts of the city and how actually close and low-lying certain neighborhoods are, adds another element to make it easier to understand the findings of these risk assessments. On the top left, you can see that we used a kind of legend to make it easier to read maps, use consistent symbols and terminology throughout the reports. And in the bottom right, you can see one example of modeling different situations. This one looks, for instance, at average travel speeds and shows actually where there would be particular problems in the road network if an evacuation would have to take place, or if you want emergency services enter the city. In this particular case, it's interesting because to the western side of the city, there's a single bridge that is of critical importance to allow an access from the west into the city. And this was then highlighted in the report and presented by layering some of the data, but also not showing certain data in order to make it easier to read those maps. Moving on to the fourth pillar, training and capacity. I did mention the role of strengthening national and subnational governments' ability to later on actually work in the loan implementation. So the loans that were being prepared alongside the technical assistance work. What came with that is a number of training sessions, virtual as well as in person. The implementation phase fell right into COVID. We had 2 years that made it very difficult with barely any in-person interaction. But it was very interesting to see how we could use that as an opportunity and adjust the training that we are offering, rather as a form of a menu that participants can choose from, instead of saying you have to do those 8 hours of this topic. And rather to say, these are 4 themes, 4 topics you can choose from. Take a course that fits your own learning needs and do them through an online platform. So that was very interesting to see how this was taken up, and it also responded to new kind of ways of training or attention span, if you want. You know, not doing the old school training and people start sleeping in the room, but actually trying to provide smaller pieces of specific learning distributed over a longer period of time. Another aspect was what I call on the slide here walkthrough sessions. For the GIS steps, we, both in Morocco and Turkey, had fairly well-capacitated GIS units. Not brilliant, but much more advanced than we find it in other country contexts. That means there were several GIS experts in the municipalities, as well as at national level. There was decent understanding of different technologies and different approaches within GIS. And so instead of doing a kind of standard slide deck training, we decided to actually take the methodology, take the large folder structure with its GIS data, and to walk through different techniques of layering and analyzing the GIS data. Now that makes for a fairly messy session. It's more like 8 people in a room, everyone looks at their screen and you're walking through the exercise. But this was much more useful than just providing a manual where you have to read, 50 pages of the same thing. And I think this was quite important for the GIS colleagues in the municipalities to use the data after the assignment. The last point maybe on this slide is to then translate the training and the learning into products that can be shared with those who did not join the trainings, and to also embed it into ongoing learning programs that most of these cities and national ministries are actually running. And that point brings me to the products, which is the final pillar I wanted to focus on. As Joanna mentioned in the beginning, we produced risk assessments for those cities. In the case of the 2 Moroccan cities, we also developed resilience strategies with action plans. So that included visioning work, setting objectives, long listing and short listing actions. And then alongside this, we thought about what type of guidance can help to institutionalize these approaches as more and more cities join the program, as the national government wants to institutionalize the disaster risk reduction and resilience planning approach. And so we developed in Morocco a handbook that was published, I think, just a few weeks back in English, French, and Arabic on how to run resilience strategy and action planning processes at the municipal level. We informed this with feedback from stakeholders, with feedback from World Bank colleagues, with inputs from the national ministry, again, to align it with the process that is foreseen to be the standard process for Moroccan municipalities. We developed a data manual. I briefly mentioned this earlier. So taking the findings from our risk assessment approaches and providing a kind of something like a wayfinding document on what are open data sources that can be used in risk assessments, what are country-specific data sources, what are private sector data sources that could be purchased to inform risk assessments. And then for ILBank in particular, as a national development bank, we developed two things. One was a guidance note on incorporating resilience into their project identification and preparation process, so updating their existing processes. And secondly, using the World Bank resilience rating system, which looks at resilience within a project, resilience of a project, as well as resilience through a project. So the co-benefits a project can achieve it in its environment, in its surroundings. And applying this to how ILBank actually screens its projects, if you want. And so there we took again an existing template that ILBank already uses for project preparation and inserted a select number of questions on resilience in alignment with the resilience rating system for ILBank through the loan implementation to basically check the projects that are being put forward by city governments or by utilities, for example, water utilities, to receive funding through the World Bank loan, but also through any other loans that ILBank may process. The key message here is to avoid parallel or new documents or processes. Wherever there is an existing process, a template, a guidance note that somehow works, we tried to update it, to amend it, rather than to add another document on the side, because we are very much aware that resilience is not the only concern of these stakeholders. Yeah, ILBank as a bank will very much still have to work on financial and commercial aspects of projects, due diligence for environmental and social safeguards, and a whole range of other topics. So adding additional documents on the side usually is a bit of a burden, so rather integrate resilience throughout existing processes and templates. I would like to close with a conclusion on what could be next, or where could the work advance further along those pillars. In terms of the national and subnational level, I did already mention how critical it is to capacitate those agencies that are implementing loan projects, and to think about how do they actually run their own procedures internally. So not just to climate-proof the investment projects, but to actually climate-proof how these institutions operate. How do they look at projects? How do they understand risks? How do they streamline their own processes to a low-carbon, climate-proof agenda? Second element about infrastructure and communities, I think, is a matter of focusing on neighborhoods. Are there options, instead of spreading investments too thinly, to focus in on particular urban transformation areas, city centers, heritage zones, and to focus in investments to show what is possible, make those model neighborhoods which can then be replicated in other parts of the city. In terms of methodologies, the reapplication of tested methodologies is a good way for cities who have done their risk assessments already to help new cities joining the program. And in terms of training and capacity, I did already note the opportunities around a menu of options. So instead of very stringent kind of courses that they have to take, to rather say, these are topics we think are important, discuss among yourselves, identify your training needs, and then have individual staff take those trainings that are most relevant to their roles. The last point about products and outcomes, I think, is we see an increasing push about thinking technical topics, for instance, in this case, climate and disaster risk, more closely interlinked with financial elements. That could be business models for urban transformation projects. It could be involvement of private sector in infrastructure delivery. It could be alignment of spending and of budgeting with climate goals that the government may have set. So I mentioned your green financing roadmaps. That's one other project we are running with the EBRD, and that's looking basically at cities that have done their action plan, that have done their risk assessments, and then to prioritize projects to take them forward to investors, both MDBs as well as other investors in the private sector, climate projects, but also to look at how do they do their accounting? How do they do their budgeting? How can they be prepared to use other instruments in the future? Let those be sustainability-linked bonds, green loans, or other instruments. And it needs that linkage technical to financial, because obviously these projects have very technical elements about what makes for a net zero intervention in the building sector. And then what does it mean for different financing approaches and instruments for these projects? So that's another thought about outcomes from these technical assistances and how they can actually form a basis onto which lending programs can be built. With that, I'm at the end of my presentation, and I think I'll hand over to the World Bank colleagues for the reactions and the discussion.
Thank you very much, Renard. Excellent and good timing. So let me pass to Zoe Trohanis, our lead DRM specialist, for some reflections from her side. Over to you, Zoe.
Thanks a lot, Joanna, and thanks, Renard. So I'm just going to very briefly, I think Renard hit on many of the key points I wanted to highlight today about the Turkey experience. But also speaking from the task team perspective, I think a few key things. One of the key points where I felt that this type of approach was successful was really having a strong engagement of both not only the city officials, right, in the 4 cities that we worked in to do these citywide climate and disaster risk assessments, but also the national government engagement. And this may have added a bit of time and effort to the process, right, to get them on board, even with the scope of work and the terms of reference. They led this process of city selection, also trying to identify very hazard-prone cities, but also smaller, medium, large, and different parts of the country to sort of see different typologies and whether there were similarities and differences between types of cities, even down to participating in the trainings and workshops, reviewing reports. So I think that was very critical to build that ownership and understanding, because then in order to replicate this work, rather than having the World Bank come, with consultant support and just doing on behalf of government, I think this hands-on approach was really valuable. And now that the government, the Ministry of Environment, Urbanization and Climate Change has seen the results in some of the cities, now this work is being replicated through our lending operation that was just approved in September on climate and disaster resilient cities. So they want to take this methodology and apply it now through the project in other cities. And they understand it and they know the value of it and they can take it on themselves. Another key point was around capacity building. And Renard mentioned this, really building an understanding of teams, not only the GIS team, but the urban planning team. I mean, bringing together all these different groups at the city level to talk about risks and vulnerability and options for reducing risk, I think is something that doesn't always happen. And having them participate actively in workshops, very hands-on, and tailoring training in a way that is understandable and sort of absorbable by people was really important, because again, it goes back to understanding and ownership. And without that, I think the program wouldn't have been quite so successful. Then really this use of trying to get the cities especially to understand their local data sets, and even talking across Turkey to different ministries trying to get data sets was an adventure, I would have to say. So buckle up if you're planning to do that in most countries. It takes quite a bit of time, but really was worth the effort in terms of then, instead of just having these global data sets only, building in local data sets with the local, GIS teams to the extent possible, really added richness, I think, to these risk assessments that, and again, the ownership where they could see their data being used. And we didn't always get the data, but I think just that process and even understanding what's available, both at the city level, national level, beyond the global data sets was important. And finally, one thing Renard didn't mention that we also did, aside from having the cities kind of learn a bit from each other, is also bringing in international experience. And that was something that AECOM helped with, including from Japan and other countries, just to showcase, for example, in an urban transformation area, how did others do it? What were the practical kind of approaches that could be replicated, right? And so I think bringing in that global experience is also really valuable to show cities and national government officials that things are possible and they have been done. And of course, they would need to be tailored to the local context. So I'll stop there, but that's just a few thoughts.
Thanks, Zoe. Very helpful indeed. Let's move on to Karima. Karima, would you like to come in?
Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. I'm actually very happy to be joining because I was leading this activity back when we just started. So it's really good to see it kind of reach this level where we can share some of the learning that we've had. I mean, it's very striking how similar Turkey and Morocco is, and Zoe was our peer reviewer for the urban resilience strategies, and it was really amazing how the thinking was very much parallel, which is trying to build that capacity through workshops, through collective thinking, so that we embed certain ideas of risk management at the city level. This was our first foray in urban resilience in Morocco. Up until 2018, our major engagement in disaster risk management was on flood risk management through financing a fund that has a mandate of co-financing communes, so essentially small rural municipalities, to do flood risk, kind of flood infrastructure. And the FSN, the fund reached a little bit its capacity, and the communes reached their capacity for implementing these projects, which meant that the fund needed really a next generation for investments. And so that was our opportunity to introduce the topic. We built on the parallel system that is in Morocco, which is the central government being deconcentrated into provinces, and the municipal system that is in parallel, but having lesser capacity, and brought the two as co-leads for the two cities, which I think that governance mechanism, understanding the governance mechanism in the country and really trying to reinforce whatever is existing is really an important lesson that could potentially be replicated. And the idea was really to create a pipeline for potential investments for the FLCN, aside from what the bank can do and can finance in this realm. And our clear intention from the beginning was that the FLCN would be the custodian in a way of this methodology, and that the two city pilots will be kind of exhibited to other cities and be essentially taken on a roadshow by the Ministry of Interior, so that there is a garnering of interest by the other cities. And I think that's what the next steps for this program is, now that the manual has been published. I really want to echo what Zoe said in terms of really creating that collaborative spirit between the key actors in cities, because that was very critical for us. And we had exactly the same issue in terms of data, because just being able to sit in the same room and saying, okay, these are the data that we miss and who has it, allowed us to, one, discover certain parts of the government that we really didn't know had access to certain information, which was very, very useful. The other element is really to kind of acknowledge the fact that there are certain things that we need to kind of think a little bit more creatively about estimating, and that was also fine, because the idea was to really try to think collectively about what the vision for the city resilience would look like. And I thought that was a very useful exercise for everybody. We insisted, I think, and that was something that AECOM was very useful for us on, is to just try to be the transcribers of the conversations that the counterparts were having amongst them, and kind of facilitate a little bit the discussion by data, by kind of the GIS maps, but not necessarily intervening in deciding what the content of the strategy is. It took much longer than we expected, but it was really very useful, because right now the municipality in Fez has a climate action plan that is financed by GAFAN, but part of the national strategy, but part of the city resilience strategy is being financed left and right by different funds and by different ministries that actually got interested in the final product, and that went beyond what the bank was actually involved in. The last thing that I want to talk about is really the pivot that we had during COVID. And it kind of brings me back to the point that Rena was talking about in terms of the diagnosis. During the workshops in the diagnosis part, we had some risk analytics done at the national level in Morocco, so we were able to scale them at the city level. But what was very interesting, and that what came out of the workshops, is really the understanding of the provincial level authority and the municipality of where the socioeconomic vulnerability hotspots are. So they knew where poor people were, where people, especially in smaller municipalities, where people with disabilities were, with people who had lack of access to hospitals and critical infrastructure. So pulling out those maps quickly and overlaying where the dispensaries were and where the hospitals were during COVID was very useful then to the government to argue for specific actions that needed to be taken very, very quickly during COVID. And then the sharing of lessons learned for COVID-specific activities, particularly when it came to informal markets in Morocco, are a common thing. So there are street vendors, there's farmers market, not the fancy kind like here in the US, but still a very important part of the Moroccan economy. And so trying to understand how the government was helping the government try to figure out how to keep that essentially lifeline for a lot of the informal workers happening while still being cognizant of a lot of the sanitary measures was a very important conversation that we had with them during COVID. So yeah, I mean, happy to elaborate on other things, but I think I'll stop here.
Thanks, Karima. Very interesting reflections, and I think a lot of similarities with Turkey in terms of the challenges around data collection, but also, you know, this work being conducted as COVID was starting. In the case of Turkey, we managed to at least have our first workshop, so we understood, you know, who was on the ground and the clients before, you know, the team couldn't, you know, visit the localities after that. So let's pass over to Eric Dixon, who's the Senior Urban and DRM Specialist based in South Africa, who's going to share from his perspective the relevance for Africa. Over to you, Eric.
Thanks, John. Making sure you can hear me. Great. Okay. Thanks very much. Well, yeah, there's just so much to react to here, and Renard, thanks very much for an interesting overview of the work that's been done in both of the countries. I have to be very selective in what I speak to, and I think maybe I'll start a little bit with the history of the World Bank engaging in South Africa, specifically on the issue of urban resilience and urban risk. As I think many people that are connected to the call will probably be aware, the lending program that many countries benefit from the World Bank does not really exist in South Africa. So there is no program per se that we're able to attach ourselves to and able to sort of help drive those investments, which makes the operating environment quite unique when it comes to, you know, issues around urban resilience. And we have almost a decade now of engagement through a reimbursable advisory services agreement, which in its first generation actually didn't explicitly include the issue of urban resilience, climate risk, until the 2017 Cape Town drought came around, that I'm sure all of us remember, when they nearly hit day zero, and there was a lot of concern around, you know, water resource management and disaster planning for slow onset events. That has really changed. So now in the second generation of our work, which covers 8 of the largest cities, you know, climate resilience and looking at issues around infrastructure resilience is one of the largest components of the work that we're doing. And I think where it's challenging is when we look at the number of plans, strategies, implementation, project plans, etc., versus actually getting the cities to implement. And I think that is one of the largest challenges here in South Africa, not just on urban resilience, but across many different sectors. So the consistency of the support, using different instruments at our disposals to help drive the agenda, is something that jumped out at me as being very, very relevant. And I think that sharing this example with the South African authorities will be very useful. Fully echo the point about the multi-sectoral engagement, Reinhard. I mean, I think all of us, we're all, preaching to the choir. But the reason I wanted to flag that is as Zoe was saying, it takes time, it takes convincing. And I say that in the context of work that we are doing on 9 different urban resilience projects that have either a PPP or a land value capture element to it. And what we're seeing is that many of the cities, as soon as it comes across, they see something to do with resilience, they immediately park it with the climate team. And the engagement of the transport team or your planning, lands team doesn't come naturally to the cities. And so that's been a major, push from us to have that multi-sectoral representation and to have consistency, so that we don't start the conversation with one person and then the next meeting someone else shows up. So that's quite a challenge. I was really happy to see the point around the institutionalization in your presentation, because that is a major focus on what we're doing. And I think a major key is what you were saying about using country systems, country instruments, and not recreating these things, and rather building on them rather than starting from scratch, which is exactly what we're doing here in South Africa. So just as an example, the City Infrastructure Delivery Management System, which is really about asset management, it's a great instrument, but it didn't have anything on climate resilience built into it. So we're supporting the South Africans in that space. Equally on the catalytic land development program, the same type of approach, whereby we're looking at what already exists and building on it. I was happy to hear about the resilience rating system. We're similarly working at the national level, looking at how can we potentially insert that into the national appraisal guidelines for all publicly invested projects. And so working with the National Treasury on that, but then equally applying it on a sort of a test case basis with one of the cities across multiple different sectors, and ones that don't necessarily align all the time with climate. So one of them is in the automotive sector. So that, I think, speaks to the transversality of some of these instruments. I think that this agenda is gaining a lot of traction in South Africa. So I'm sure that everyone saw the big announcement that came out of COP last year, with South Africa securing about $8.5 billion US to support their decarbonization efforts, and that is to be absolutely applauded, and in a very complicated agenda to advance. Where I see very important progress is that the Presidential Climate Commission that has been tasked with driving that agenda has been very clear that a transition away from carbon must also incorporate adaptation. And that adaptation, they're also recognizing, really happens in cities. And so, again, if we look back to 2013, when the World Bank's engagement started, to where we are today, it's a completely different context. And I think that taking some of these methodologies, taking the approaches that you've outlined, Reinhard, and applying them, and then being able to inject that into these national level processes will really, add value to the overall dialogue that we have here. I could go on and on, but I'm going to stop there in order to just open the conversation up. Thanks very much for the invitation.
Perfect, Eric. Thanks. Let's open up then, if anyone would like to ask any questions or share any experience from their perspective. We open up the floor. Maybe you can take 2 or 3. Please don't be shy. No, nothing.
Well, I'll come in with one last point then, just to keep the conversation moving a little bit. Reinhard, you talked about capacity building, role of community, and data, and now I'm gonna go back to to Tanzania, and how long things can take, where we take almost a year of consultation and bringing in community members in order to be able to really engage and understand what options for adaptation existed there. And so I think that was a very important point that you made. And ultimately we were able to use those data sets and take them to the local universities. So we begin to grow the pie, if you will, of climate aware urban planners for that country. Back to you, Joanna.
Thank you very much, Eric. One last chance if anybody would like to come in.
Hi, good morning.
Hi.
My name is Vincent Bolan. My question is, what would, after the community engagements that would have taken place, what would have been the greatest need, and how would you have sort of addressed them in the overall action plan or pillars that have been sort of laid out? You know, because I'm working on a financing product to address certain things here in the Caribbean, but I'm just wondering if, you know, rather than reinvent the wheel, whether there were things that were addressed based on the needs coming out of the community engagements that were taking place. Thank you.
I don't know who would like to give this a go. Renard, I don't know, you would understand better whether community engagements happened in either of the cases.
Yeah, I'm trying to. So one possible answer, maybe. I think the important part of the findings from the risk assessment was to then understand who is owning these assets. Because if you want to understand resilience proving measures, it makes a huge difference if this is, for instance, highway infrastructure managed by the provincial roads authority versus residential housing, which is owned by individual flat owners. So there was a lot of work also in parallel to our work on different housing improvement models that could be tried out in Turkey as part of the national government's urban transformation investments. So that was one element, figuring out who is actually owning these assets, how can they be improved if they are at risk and don't need to be completely moved. So that was one important finding. I don't know if Zoe or Karima, you have insights as well in this one.
Maybe just to add that in terms of, so this work, at least in Turkey, maybe Karima can speak to Morocco, but it wasn't sort of a full community engagement where you invite lots and lots and lots of stakeholders to these meetings. It was more targeted with national city officials, and then also NGOs and other groups were invited when we were able to do in-person work. And so just to get that perspective, but I think the issue is more, at least identifying with these different groups using data sets, but then even, I don't know if you saw in the presentation on maps where people would go and point to actual areas where they knew flooding would occur, or they knew there were issues in terms of transport, you know, reaching the hospital, for example, in case of an emergency, or you choke in the infrastructure where it gets tighter to get through. So I think that was maybe more on the engagement side, but definitely, at least now moving to the lending operation that we have, one of the big issues, at least for Turkey, where the government has worked hard and in the past maybe struggled a bit, is on this community engagement, especially for urban transformation, where you're going in and redeveloping blocks, right, which includes housing, where you need quite a bit of consultation. So that's also a process they're working on now, as well as with the infrastructure investments more under the project. But this approach definitely engaged different members from the community, but I wouldn't say that it was a sort of CDD approach to identify individual investments that need upgrading.
On the Morocco side, when we created these committees that did the visioning and the strategy design, we had representatives from CSOs and from academia, but we didn't really do a large event where people from different communities are invited to participate, simply because these are big cities compared for Morocco. One of them is 1 million inhabitants, the other one is 700, and it is attached to the biggest city in Morocco. It's a sort of a satellite city. So it was a little bit difficult to really think about community engagement. And especially that at this stage of the urban resilience strategy, it's really at the very kind of a high level. And then the action planning is really to kind of have a proposal for financeable investments that then could undergo the community engagement process. I think that's suffice to say, though, that a lot of the people that were part of these committees were actually also from the city, you know, so and in that diagnosis that kind of came out very strongly. So, for instance, we had a lot of conversations with people that said, well, no, but I know this neighborhood and I know the people that live there. And so that kind of, for us, was very informative in the diagnosis process, but it wasn't really a clear community engagement or CDD type of analytics.
If I could try to quickly answer Chandan's question in the chat about the events. Morocco COVID-19 was really of huge importance. The interlinkages of tourism, economy, and what it means for the city's infrastructure, social services, and support for local inhabitants, I think, was a key primer. In Turkey, there were too many to mention. I mentioned earlier, landslides and flooding happened in one city. You had the border conflicts in Syria, huge influx of immigrants into informal settlements, also at the European Union border side. There were several earthquakes during that period. And then as a positive element, most recently, Turkey signed up to the Paris Agreement, which has given another different push to climate action at the subnational level.
In the case of Morocco, we started the urban resilience activities prior to COVID. It was 2 years before, but we had the Marrakesh COP, and I think that heightened the awareness of the counterparts on climate action, particularly. And Fez was one of the cities that was very keen to have climate resilience at the heart of their urban resilience strategy, and I think that really was a big push. But really, the genesis from these cities have recurring flash floods, and it's a yearly issue. You know, so it is always on the mind of of decision makers. It's just that articulating it and going through that process of thinking about what to do ex ante had not been done yet. So, kind of the momentum was brought from the integrated disaster resilience project, which is the one that is at the central level, and then the COP coming in, and there was a lot of dialogue as well, which kind of speaks a little bit to the importance of such events to mainstream disaster risk awareness and resilience in the minds of decision makers as well.
I can just come in very quickly. So on the community side of things, you know, really in South Africa, the focus has been on community engagement and partnership for slum upgrading, and not so much on the climate resilience side of things. But I've just done a shameless plug of a video that we've just launched today, speaking of COP, that is being aired in Egypt on community led urban heat mapping in Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni, and that really builds on the climate action plans that the cities have developed, and then obviously speaks to, you know, issues around greening and climate sensitive urban design. So please do take a look if you're a Twitter user. I am not, but hopefully everyone will like it. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Maybe, Joanna, just before we wrap, I want to come in on Eric's point, because I think it's quite important on the urban greening. And one thing that we had a super hard time in Turkey is talking about nature-based solutions, which is interesting because it seems, you know, you try and explain, but the government is very sort of, I don't know if they weren't convinced, or they just were saying, well, we're not going to spend our money on something like that. We want to see hard infrastructure. So I think that that's also something for urban resilience and these types of assessments, even though we did try through the international best practices to showcase through this work what that could look like. So things, you know, more nature-based solutions for flood protection or landslide prevention. I think it may take a little bit more convincing in certain places than others. So I'm glad to hear, Eric, that in South Africa that you don't have that same challenge that we've had. So I'll stop there. Sorry, Joanna.
No, thanks a lot, Zoe. We're at the end of the session, but I wanted to ask Renard if he had any final thoughts from his side before I finish up.
Maybe the one point I made at the end of the presentation is to interlink even more closely technical support and interventions with financial aspects around what type of projects, what type of instruments are feasible, and to start it very early, because a lot of cities and national governments have a long journey in trying out and maturing in terms of instruments. So the earlier we can start the discussion, the better, I think.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. I just wanted to perhaps pick up 4 takeaways from my side very briefly. I mean, the first one being, ideally it's important to think about the physical assets and the communities, so both sides. Secondly, it really requires national and local engagement and thinking about the custodians, as Karima mentioned, of the assessments. But these multi-sector discussions as well, and Eric emphasized that as well, and ensuring that, the data collected through those discussions are aligned with what's being used locally and handed over in a way that can be replicated and used again. Third, it really helps to have these different types of visual outputs to ensure that they're readable, as Renard said, but also absorbable, as Zoe mentioned. So, having these in varied ways with different maps and imageries. And then the fourth being, to have the varied and flexible ways for training based on people's interests, based on their availability, time, so having them available over a longer period of time in shorter pieces that people can pick up what's of interest. And then just finally, just picking up again what Renard said on what could be next. And I think Eric mentioned this too, about how do we embed this in our clients' ongoing efforts themselves. Eric mentioned about appraisal guidelines, and with Turkey case, we looked at how do we sort of integrate within their project cycle themselves. So I think that's key when we're thinking through any of these types of assignments. And then finally, this link between the technical and the financial, which Renard mentioned. So how do we build on these risk assessments and climate change action plans and link them to accounting, budgeting, land value capture, and green finance? And finally, as Eric mentioned, how do you link the decarbonization process to this adaptation and resilience efforts? So big thanks to Renard and the AECOM team for their work on this and taking the time to share and present to us, and to Zoe, Karima, and Eric for reflecting. And thanks everybody for being here and your questions, and look forward to hearing how you're going to pick up some of these ideas in your work. So thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks again.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.